It's deja vu all over again. Welcome to the Millennial Harbinger channel. My name is Dr. Jordan Koss.
And here we go.
I want to have a conversation with you today about this book that I found in a bookstore recently. It's called Homosexuality in the Church, Both Sides of the Debate. It was published in 1994, a little over 30 years ago. And the first two chapters deal with the exegesis of the passage from two different perspectives, the affirming and a non-affirming perspective. The first chapter was written by none other than Richard Hayes when he was still non-affirming. The second chapter was written by Victor Paul Furnish, a prominent scholar who's written a ton of commentaries and articles, etc. You've probably heard of him. Now, the editor, his name is Jeffrey Siker. It's a collection of essays, this book, and he writes the final chapter relaying why he changed his mind from being non-affirming to affirming. So he's an example of a non-affirming Christian becoming affirming over 30 years ago, before, let's say, Richard Hayes came out with his book, A Widening of God's Mercy. So Siker foreshadowed Hayes with his kind of, you could say, OG, I changed my mind perspective. Now, many people have changed their minds before Siker, but he's kind of in the American evangelical published world. He's perhaps a good example to look at to see what led to his change of heart and mind, and compare contrast to Hayes in some ways. But let's look at chapter 1 first and what Richard Hayes wrote.
We're ready to believe you.
Now, chapter 1 is called Awaiting the Redemption of Our Bodies, the witness of Scripture concerning homosexuality. And this chapter sounds a lot like what you read and see in his book, A Moral Vision of the New Testament. And here we see Hayes's reasoning of the text when he was still, again, non-affirming, ironically within a book all about someone changing their mind on a topic of homosexuality. And it's ironic because he changed his mind 30 years later, just recently, coming out with that book, explaining to some extent why he did. Though we've covered that book in a previous video, and he really didn't. They didn't try to go into the text in any depth in that book to kind of defend their stances and interpretations and exegesis, which was kind of disappointing. But this is kind of an ironic book when I found it, and I saw him at the beginning, and the book basically being about here's why and how I changed my mind by Siker. In terms of Hayes' treatment of Romans 1, he calls it, again, the most crucial text, frequently misunderstood. But overall, he has a disenchanted take in light of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Now, most of the non-affirming takes and arguments that we've looked at, we've made that delineation or conclusion. And Hayes really hasn't done anything different than other non-affirming scholars and authors. He says homosexuality is not a provocation of the wrath of God. Rather, it is a consequence of God's decision to give up rebellious creatures to follow their own futile thinking and desires. The unrighteous behavior cataloged in verses 26 to 31 is a list of symptoms. The underlying sickness of humanity as a whole, Jews and Greeks alike, is that they have turned away from God and fallen under the power of sin. So that quote is can serve perhaps as an example of the disenchanted nature of his interpretation, of his exegesis. And we'll kind of explain that here in a minute a little bit more. But he takes the all-humanity view, which, as we've seen, if you're going to take a non-affirming stance, the all-humanity view tends to lean towards that direction. Now, he says, in light of that, it's a global account of the universal fall of humanity, not just Gentiles. He says Paul parallels with Hellenistic Jewish heritage here in his thoughts in Romans 1. He also says he only specifically refutes the affirming view that states Paul refutes only the homosexual acts committed by heterosexual persons because it goes against their natural sexual orientation, which Furnish and Siker kind of argue for in later chapters. It's the only one he decides to try to refute. But he has a disenchanted interpretation or understanding of exchange. He doesn't really discuss any Old Testament passages that form the background of Paul's thinking. But he says this: Paul's characterization of the fallen condition of the pagan world is communicated by the word exchange, which in general, yes, that's true, but there's so much more missing when you fully unpack that term exchange and its Old Testament background. Okay?
What? Don't cross the streams.
In chapter 2, switching to the affirming take on Romans 1 by Victor Paul Furnish, he says, or he takes the Gentile-only view, affirming Gentile-only, non-affirming usually takes all humanity. He says that once again, just like Hayes, Paul parallels the thinking of Hellenistic Jewish heritage. He specifically mentions Wisdom of Solomon, which says idolatry leads to sexual immorality, including homosexuality, but he doesn't unpack that at all, which I think that the Deuteronomy 32 worldview can help lead us towards unpacking that better, that connection. He says that Paul has a lot of unnamed presuppositions, but they're the same presuppositions as those who live within the Greco-Roman culture. And he does not address his reason for opposing same-sex sexuality. He's like, Paul doesn't explain why. He doesn't list his reasons at all. He just, as he says here, simply presumes without argument that homosexual practice is contrary to God's will. And we'll talk about whether that, is true or not, or accurate or not. Other things he said within his chapter, he says there's nothing distinctively Pauline or even Christian in Romans 1, which is like, wow, that's a really strong stance to take. And I don't think I agree with that, but that's what he says. And following that, he says, while it is true that this is the only biblical reference to same-sex practice that stands within a specifically theological context, the point of view that it represents has no distinctively Christian roots. Rather, it is nourished by presuppositions that were widespread in ancient culture, including Hellenistic Judaism. Nor is there any evidence that Paul's thinking on this subject was specifically informed either by the rule of Leviticus 18 and 20 or by the story of Sodom, Old Testament stories that have traditionally been understood to communicate something about homosexuality. So it's really interesting. Nothing distinctively Christian within Romans 1. That is a strong stance.
It's a couple of wavy lines.
Okay. One thing I agree with that he states is that the Genesis creation accounts do not form the backdrop of Paul's argument in Romans 1. He says he seems to be relying mainly on Wisdom of Solomon 13 to 15 and not Genesis 1 through 3. I agree with his take about the Genesis creation accounts, not so much, though, with only Wisdom of Solomon. He offers a social convention argument later related to 1 Corinthians 11 in his refutation of the Genesis backdrop argument. And so in light of that, I want to make like 3 observations about what Furnish said within his chapter that I think can be helpful if we want to like re-enchant our reading of Romans 1 and have a better take ourselves, a more accurate, perhaps, understanding of what Paul is really trying to get at. And in fact, maybe see even the reasons that Paul gives, if not completely fleshed out within the letter.
I collect spores, molds, and fungus.
Number 1, the presupposition argument is the same as Loder's assumption argument and the social convention argument. The assumption argument by William Loder, the social convention argument that Dan McClellan talks about in his recent book on the subject, or within the chapter in that book. And one thing Furnish says is as they generally presuppose beliefs about the physical world, human beings, social relationships that we can no longer presuppose. And I just can't get behind that. That is a really, really too strong of a stance, I would say, to say, hey, yeah, the inspired apostolic authors, they had it wrong. The way they were thinking about the world wasn't completely accurate. We actually have better understanding now of the physical world, of why somebody, let's say, is same-sex attracted, etc. And therefore, because they were basically ignorant, with bad presuppositions, we don't have to listen to them. But all three of those arguments kind of basically say the same thing.
That's a big Twinkie.
Number 2, inference is tricky. If you grew up in the denomination called Churches of Christ, you know how tricky inference can be in terms of making some conclusions that are kind of way out of left field. And so one of the things he says in terms of inference is every biblical reference or allusion to same-sex intercourse presumes that it is wrong, but no specific arguments, theological or otherwise, are offered to explain why. These must be inferred from the literary, cultural, and theological context of each reference. Yes, I think there's a lot of inference that's needed, but perhaps he's kind of overstating his case. Here in Romans 1, maybe, okay? But inference is tricky. His inference leads him to the presupposition argument. And maybe we can make a determination on whether that is right or not. And I think if you've been watching along this channel, you would know that I think that inference is incorrect. And that there's different inferences that we can make here, specifically, especially in light of Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 or Divine Counsel worldview.
What about the Twinkie?
Okay, number 3, his take is disenchanted, just like Hayes's was. Now, I agree with Hayes's overall stance, but he really doesn't dive too deeply into the passage at all when you really read the chapter. And Furnish, not perhaps because the book was written for a popular audience. Maybe that's why. But I guess I was a little disappointed in both chapters in terms of how they handled Romans 1. But his overall take is disenchanted. He only discusses wisdom of Solomon and Greco-Roman writings and nothing about other Old Testament passages. I mean, he discusses Genesis 1 and 2, the creation accounts, as not forming the backdrop. Again, I agree with that, but nothing about Deuteronomy 4, Psalm 106, etc. that Paul actually, quotes and references within the chapter. And why he doesn't see that or talk about that, I don't know. Many don't. He doesn't discuss what Heiser calls the Deuteronomy 32 worldview or what could be that wider theological context that could help us understand Romans 1 better. The wider theological context that didn't have a name like this, the Divine Counsel worldview or Deuteronomy 32 worldview back in 1994. The scholarship was out there. It just wasn't like kind of pieced together and put together the way Heiser did it when he published in 2015. But he has no discussion on exchange or handed over, the metonyms, and no mention of supernatural evil whatsoever. And I think that does one's handling and take on Romans 1 a disservice when none of those are discussed in depth at all or mentioned, because as we'll see and as we have seen, supernatural evil is all throughout, embedded within Paul's argument in Romans 1 and in other places in the letter.
You said crossing the streams was bad.
Okay. Real quick about Siker's chapter at the end of the book. Now, Siker takes the Gentile-only view, not surprised. He says pederasty and male prostitution by heterosexual Gentiles, that's what the problem was, exploitative forms of homosexual sex. But those aren't analogous to all expressions of homosexual practice in our day and age. They're non-exploitative forms that are good, he argues. So we should not adopt first century social constructions or assumptions and presuppositions like Loder, like Furnish. And he even says Paul's arguments have little to teach us directly about homosexuality as we understand it today, which again is a very strong stance to take. And it's based upon a different, approach with hermeneutics and inspiration, it feels like. But his treatment of Romans 1 was very general, even less so than Furnish and Hayes, but similar disenchanted take as the two of them. As a result,
Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
okay. In terms of wrapping up this video, which I didn't want it to take too long, I have a few things I want to say. and maybe a few other things that come to mind as I say them. But the first thing is, in light of this month being June 2026, Pride Month, the scholarship that went into the Unseen Realm, published in 2015, was already present for some time when Heiser connected the dots into the DCW. But affirming and non-affirming scholars before then, and even now after, are still having a disenchanted conversation in terms of Romans 1, ignoring and or not seeing important elements in the text that we've discussed throughout this whole channel, 40 plus videos. Okay. Number 2, the background to wisdom of Solomon's sexual ethic, and as they themselves have said, Paul's ethic in Romans 1, is not a social, but rather a Jewish Christian theological construct. It's not a cultural construct from the Greco-Roman culture time period, but rather, I would argue, it's a Jewish Christian theological construct. And that what Paul says here is unique in terms of being Jewish and Christian, is unique on the topic of homosexuality, the way perhaps a pagan person living in Rome would have thought about it. Okay? A hermeneutic, I think I spelled that one incorrectly, but a hermeneutic devoid of enchantment leads to the social construction, presupposition, and assumption argument. And in a number of ways, but especially in terms of how one views the topic of homosexuality, and how a disenchanted reading causes us to miss many different things within the text that could lead us there. Okay? Again, we've already discussed all of those things, many of the things, and I want to discuss more in future videos.
He slimed me.
Okay, here we go. I think this is the last slide. Paul actually does address reasons for his take on same-sex relations, I would argue. And it was evident and explicit to the original audience, to Paul himself, the author. But we deem it inferential and not explicit because when we read the text, it's just not to us. Because again, as other people have argued, we're so divorced from the context and time period, we don't see as readily what the original audience would have been like, oh yeah, oh, I totally see that. It would have been like taking no effort whatsoever for them to notice what Paul was saying in terms of his reasons why, as it does for us. It takes us a lot more effort to see it. So, and these reasons, I think, are extremely Jewish and Christian, and informed by Leviticus and Genesis 19, because everything is informed by the Deuteronomy 32 worldview that has its Genesis, no pun intended, within the prologue of that book in chapters 1 through 11, in the 3 rebellions, the divorcing of the nations, the impact of the supernatural rebel beings and their evil influence upon humanity, starting in Eden, the Watchers on Hermon in Genesis 6, the building of the Tower of Babel, the rebellion of the sons of God put over the nations at Babel, as a result of Babel, that we see kind of happening in the first city that we come across in Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, which, as we've argued, parallels the overall story of the flood from Genesis 6 to 9. And so you need to read Sodom in light of the Watchers and the flood story, because the structure among many of the other elements they're intended to be read together and compared and contrasted and understood with each other. But a specific example of where we see Paul's reasons why he says that we need to think negatively in terms of same-sex sexual relations are sinful is that term handed over, where we see the supernatural evil beings playing that significant role in influencing humanity into depravity. Handed over insinuates and assumes the way the original audience would have understood it, to hand it over to those very beings. And like Heiser argues, Romans 1 kind of reiterates what happened at Babel, but in Paul's own words. And so handed over is, I would say, one of those explicit reasons why that Paul mentions within Romans 1, that homosexuality is something that should be avoided in the Christian life. Homosexuality in terms of same-sex sexual relations, not the attraction itself, correct? Okay, so there is one place that I would argue that where we see a specific reason given, but we don't see it initially because, again, we're so divorced from context. And when we ignore the Old Testament passages and perhaps other information that I haven't even found yet, I think more is out there. I just have yet to create a video about it. That we don't see the weight of the term handed over. We disenchant it. We don't see it referring to being handed over to those actual rebel spiritual beings who, as a result of being handed over to them in light of Babel, they spiritually enslave humanity to the point of the Father needing to hand the Son over in Romans 8:32, and through that handing over via the cross, defeat the powers and principalities and authorities and rebel sons of God so that he could free us to return to him, to free the nations that come back to Yahweh. Okay, I'll stop talking there. That's all I've got today. Thanks for watching to the end of the video. We'll come out hopefully with another video soon, rather than how it's taken us a long time to these past couple of videos to get those out. But again, appreciate you watching. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
And I stand by my performance.
He shall